Thank you so much for speaking to me. I appreciate you taking the time to speak to me.
Sure.
First of all, congratulations on the book. It's such a great anthology.
Thank you.
I mean, obviously, when there's so many short stories put into one book, a lot of people say that there's like 3 or 4 really great ones, and then 3 or 4 kind of dud ones. But what I'm really curious about is right at the beginning of the book, in the introduction, you actually mentioned that you don't really see these as specifically as horror stories. You see them as Lansdale stories. So I'm quite curious, because you don't kind of really think of them in terms of a specific genre. That must have been quite brain-racking for you to decide which stories to include in this book. And also, I'm quite curious why you decided to give it a specific genre for the anthology, to call it horror stories.
Well, I think I called it horror stories so I could have a place where I could sell them.
Yeah, true.
Because a lot of times my stories are hard to classify. So Tachyon, who published this book, also did a collection of crime stories, which sometimes cross over into horror or mainstream or whatever your definition is. And it's the same with this collection. And I've never really cared that much for all the titles, but sometimes just from a commercial standpoint, that how do you present these to the audience? And so they had horror stories, crime stories, and then the Lovecraftian volume that they did of my work that has a lot of Lovecraft connections to stories. So it was really just pragmatic more than anything else. And what was the other part of that question?
Well, I mean, obviously it's pragmatic and commercial as well. You want a specific kind of, or you want to target the audience. No, but I'm quite curious, because you don't like to pigeonhole any of your work. I'm quite curious how you went about deciding which stories would fit in here.
Well, the truth is, like I said, the crime collection could easily have been the horror collection for the most part, and vice versa. A lot of this is crime, not all of it. I mean, it's not that simple. But
yeah,
the thing is I also had a good editor named Rick Claw at Tachyon Books, who helped me with both of those volumes, and we I suggested certain things. There were things that I said I have to have this in, and then there were others that we bounced around a little bit and decided which one would go. And so he was helpful. I mean, I've known Rick for a long time. He's a very good editor. He knows my work very well. And so that was helpful. And I think there are still probably half a dozen stories that should have been in this volume, but you only have so much room and so much, so much space to put it in.
And look, going back to these stories, when you read them now, and then you kind of, in retrospect, what kind of, I mean, you explain a little bit before each story. You do kind of go into a little bit of detail about how it came about, and also what it kind of meant to you now. So I'm quite curious how you felt about kind of revisiting your stories. Is that something you do quite often? Do you revisit your work, or you just try and kind of, I've written that's as it needs to be?
Do that unless it's for be reposted, so to speak, in another volume. And sometimes I don't even do that, because that has a life of its own.
Sure.
But for something like this, where I was picking, I reread a handful of them, and others I felt like I knew pretty well. But I didn't go through and just read every one and make sure. I read one of them aloud the other day to an audience, Fish Night, and I was quite happy with it. But I also saw that there were little things I would have changed had I written it now. But they were very, very small things. But Fish Night was probably the first good story I ever wrote, or maybe the second good story I ever wrote. So I'm very happy with how all these stories hold up to me.
Yeah, that was one of my questions. I really feel that it's great that they do hold up, but at the same time, because they hold up for a lot of the horrible things that are going on in the world right now.
Absolutely.
It's kind of like a bittersweet coincidence, that they're so present now. No.
Well, when I wrote some of them, there was a lot of stuff going on that I wanted to comment on, and a lot of that stuff that I commented on is now accelerated once again, and so the stories are, as you said, I think valid again, And I think they've always been valid. I don't think they've ever not been valid, but I think right now they're extremely valid, you know.
Hmm.
And so I'm very pleased with the collection, and I was very pleased, and if I say so myself, and I do that all the stories were pretty damn even, you know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the anthology for me works so well. There wasn't one that I didn't feel didn't live up to the rest of the work. I mean, there was two or three real highlights for me,
Yeah.
which I'll talk about later. But I mean, the whole kind of the anthology worked so well. It wasn't really any highs or lows. Not just choosing the stories, but also it's almost like a musician kind of deciding which tracks need to go in
Yep.
which order. I imagine you kind of that you had to kind of get your head around that as well and
Well,
decide which order to tell them in.
well, the order was actually done by the editor, and
Oh,
he
right.
he made the choice of the. But you know, he had me look at it, see if I was okay with it, and all that, and I was. So he decided what he felt should go first. I think on another day I might have decided different, and on another day he might have decided different.
Yeah.
But I was pleased with the way it was put together. I've no complaints, you know, and it also showed the variety of the different kinds of stories I've written, and if we're going to call these horror, certainly some I think are certainly fit well within that genre, and others are a little bit more difficult to nail down, you know. But things like the Hoodoo Man, the Midnight Train, and the Hungry Snow, and the Folding Man, I think those all fit definitively within the horror field, you know. And there are my times when I'm saying I'm going to go in here and I'm going to go straight for the horror story of the
Yeah.
campfire tale as we think of it. And I also like primarily to tell my stories from a storyteller's point of view, meaning I start at the first and I end at the end.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean I don't occasionally experiment or that I violated that in times, because I have. I go where the story takes me, but I think my storytelling tradition shows up when I write most of the stuff I write.
Mm-hmm. Something else I love about so that you talk about in this, especially that I think it was before. There was one story that was particularly short. My Dead Dog Bobby,
Oh yeah.
which is it's just under 2 pages, and you talk about
Mhm.
how flash fiction is so unfairly dismissed. And I
Yes.
love that you bring this up because it is something that I mean, not just flash fiction, but short fiction in general.
Yeah.
I
Right.
mean, a lot of people love it, but normally it's more than not. But people prefer novels because they know that they're going to go into a novel and it's going to be the
Yeah.
good, very good, poor, middling.
And you
Whereas
know,
if they go
another
into like
another
an
reason for that is
anthology,
a lot of good short stories are about ideas. Not all of them, but about ideas, and people don't want to deal with that. They're not necessarily bad or good. That's just the nature of humans, you know. They
mm-hmm.
just don't want to deal with that. They want to just be entertained. They're not about even style or anything. They're just about plot. You
Yeah,
know, it's plot driven, and I love a good plot much as anybody. But I really like style, and I like stories too that occasionally stray from the pure storytelling aspect and bring in social and political aspects without beating you over the head with it, you know.
yeah.
And I've tried to do that.
Mm-hmm. And I also really like the fact that you use some of this flash fiction because I think that will really resonate with younger readers because they're so used to being
Hope
on
so.
the telephone and swiping through short videos, 10 seconds, 10 seconds, 10 seconds. So I think those kind of stories, I think they deserve a lot more recognition than they actually get. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I hope so. The way I see it now, I've been doing this 52 years. I've been published 52 years, and 40 of that being really, active full time. 42, I think. It's sad to look around now because a lot of people aren't reading, and
Yeah.
they don't. They couldn't tell satire from straightforward story, and it's scary, and it's not really their fault. It's sort of the way they've been de-educated, really, not so
Yeah.
much educated, but de-educated, or lack of education, and the fact that technology has taken the room out of the stories. It's made it a whole different thing, and it's made it something that people aren't necessarily drawn to, and it's a real shame because I do think that we're in a bad way right now. Will that change? Will it? It's hard to say. It doesn't look good.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. And especially with AI, artificial intelligence coming at the moment. I mean, from
Yeah.
an author's viewpoint, how do you see AI? Because I mean,
I don't think it's all bad. I think it's bad from the standpoint of creativity, like, stories and things like that. And it's not even a matter of if it can do it, it's a matter of who's it borrowing from to do it. And so it's not really just creating it out of thin air, it's taking existing works and creating them from that. And so I feel bad about that. But AI, you ain't going to whip AI. It's going to happen, and it's
gonna
beyond
whip us.
control. It's
Yeah.
just too big. It's just too powerful. And I've always thought it will extend into everything, and it's been around a long time. I mean, we're using AI right now.
Yep.
And you have phones in your pocket. That's AI, and they land airplanes by AI and have been for years. So it's not like AI is new, but
Yeah.
AI has reached a much larger frame of reference than it had before, and that's kind of scary.
Yeah, and I want to go all the way back to kind of the early stories that you've written. Some of the stories, there's a lot of things that I guess you probably wouldn't get away with nowadays. Certain things that you say about that are in the stories about religion, racism, these kind of things is very hard hitting.
It'd be harder.
Sorry,
it'd be harder. Yeah.
Yeah.
Harder to get away
So
with.
I'm quite curious, but was that something that you were concerned about when you were going to republish these stories? Because especially racism and then kind of the way you speak about religion?
They're all valid. I wouldn't change a word of them.
Yeah.
I meant them to be exactly what they are. And I don't think that you address things by dancing around them or trying to make everybody happy or be polite. Horror is supposed to be kind of confrontational.
Yeah.
That's what makes it horror. And it can be kind of like, juicy, fun little monster horror. And I love that as well. And wrote some for this anthology, or had some in this collection, rather. But that's not all it's there for. And fiction in general, and I think of and sort of moving away from just horror fiction, just fiction in general, literary fiction, or whatever you want to call it, is supposed to be about ideas. It's supposed to be uncomfortable, at least a lot of the time. It's supposed to address concerns that aren't always pleasant. Life's just full of little disappointments, and you're going to be confronted with them. That's all there is to it. And this whole idea that we need to develop this universe where everybody is everything's happy is just bullshit.
Yeah.
It doesn't work that way. And no matter what you think or want or what you fear will trigger you, you can't really anticipate those things, nor should you. I mean, if you don't want to read fiction, don't read it. And that seems to be the choice that a lot of people have made. And another one is that if you're going to read fiction, at least have some tools for understanding what fiction does and how it works. Know that satire is not meant to be taken literally, but it is meant to be a literal interpretation of something that you're trying to express.
Yep. But going back to the same topic, I'm quite curious why quite a few of these stories in this anthology are they're very specific about kind of people using religion or maybe power, if we think about it in nowadays terms, using power as an excuse to do things that they claim to be for the greater good, right? Was that something that you grew up with and your kind of experience? Because it feels very strong in some of the stories.
Yeah, I grew up around a lot of religion and racism. And when I was young, probably about 10, 11 years old, I wanted to be a preacher. And I read the Bible, and that cured me. I no longer wanted to be a preacher because I said, this is it. This is a whole lot like the mythology I like the Greek and Roman, Norse mythology. And it just sort of opened a door. And it's kind of like I could look in and see the works. And I said, this is very human. There's nothing divine about this at all. Nothing. And so, I saw people using religion to justify all kinds of terrible things. Like there's a story in there called By Bizarre Hands. I don't know if it's in this one. I think it's in the crime volume. And but that was based on real things. A lot of this stuff is based on real things, real happenings that I extrapolated into broader stories. So I wanted to comment on the racism I saw, the use of religion to justify racism, among many other things. and extreme politics, left or right. I wanted to show that life is more complex than we like for it to be. And people are more complex than we like for them to be. They don't always fit into little comfortable boxes. And
Mhm.
that's a whole lot of what I write about, is that
Mhm.
uh, it's not about what you want, it's about what you get.
Yeah. And did you choose some of these stories specifically to raise awareness about things that are going on today? Was there anything specifically that you chose for this book, thinking about that?
Well, I don't think I was thinking about that so much when we were putting the stories together, but I've always thought about that as a writer. And
Sure.
so when I was first writing these stories, as I said earlier, is that the same problems exist in different forms, and they get better sometimes, and then they get worse. But if we don't look at them, we don't ignore them, or or that we do ignore them, we start looking at things as if they don't exist, or that that old slavery stuff wasn't that bad, just people
Yeah.
kind of hanging around the plantation, foolish stuff that we do to disguise history so that we don't hurt our own little feelings. And I think
Yeah.
that's just not true. And it doesn't make us terrible people. It just makes it history. And it means that if you don't understand it, you're apt to repeat it. And from what I can tell, we don't learn a damn thing. We do repeat it.
Yeah.
And, you keep yelling from the treetops, hoping somebody will listen. And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
There, yeah. Hmm. But I want to go back to your childhood. I mean, I mentioned there that I was wondering what kind of things inspired you, maybe that you'd grown up around. And something that you mentioned quite a bit is the fact that a lot of the stories that you were told as a child, maybe from your grandmother, was one example. How much kind of while you were growing up as a child, how much of the storytelling of maybe your parents or your grandparents played a role in you becoming a writer, and also writing this specific type of writing, the Lansdale
Well,
genre, if you will?
yeah, well, East Texas is Southern Gothic, or was, especially then. It's changed a lot now, But when I was growing up, it was very Southern Gothic because it was not like the rest of Texas, which is more southwestern in tone. East Texas and all along that Gulf Coast there is much more Southern Gothic feel, about
Right.
it, because we're trees and water and alligators and lots of snakes and different things, because it's right next to Louisiana. So people who come there expecting it to be like buttes and deserts and mountains, there's none of that, not in East
Mhm.
Texas. And it's totally different. And so the environment itself, the geography, as it were, affected the way I saw a lot of things. And my grandmother was born in the 1880s. And so as a child, she saw Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in probably
Yeah, I
the
was
early
reading. Yeah.
1900s, somewhere in there. I'm not sure exactly, in one of its incarnations, and she never forgot it. And she also came to Texas in a covered wagon, and she saw men go to the moon. And she was nearly 100 when she died. And there was that. And she had stories, old Scotch Irish ghost stories, and stories of the frontier, and of traveling the wagon and what she saw. And I think probably a lot of Native American tribes camped along the rivers, as I recall the stories going. And so I absorbed all that when I was a kid. And then my dad was like 41 or 2 when I was born. And so he had gone through the Great Depression, as had my mother, who was a few years younger. And so they were of a totally different generation. My brother and I are 17 years apart. So I was
All
the
right.
happy accident, you know. And and so our generations couldn't have been more different. But I sort of grew up in several generations. I grew up in my grandmother's and my parents and my own generation of the 50s and 60s. When I was coming of age, and I probably include middle 70s in that. All that sort of imprints you, that period of time. So I was listening to my dad, who could not read or write. He was,
All right.
illiterate, and they told stories, and some of them were true and some of them weren't, and some of
Mhm.
them were folklore, and some of them were stories passed down as the truth and may or may not have been. And so they would get out in the yard on a summer spring night when it starts, instead of being in a house where it was hot, because we didn't have air conditioning, they had fans, but we would sit out there under a tree, and they would tell stories, and I would listen. You know, there were other kids there, and some they would listen some, but they would go off and chase fireflies, and I would sit and listen.
Hmm.
And I think that framed a lot of the way I tell a story and the way I go into a story is listening to my father, especially tell his tales. But I come from a storytelling generation as well as their generation. By the end of the 60s and 70s, that was starting to be a little less so. But so all of those were influences, along with the fact that I was a voracious reader, you know, and
Yeah.
my mother was a voracious reader. Unlike my father, she wasn't illiterate. She was self educated for the most part, but she introduced me to anthropology and archaeology and history and all sorts of things like that. So I had a lot of influences coming at me, including comics, which was probably my first real impetus to want to write, was wanting to draw and write comics. But as I used to say, you know, and when I was 4, I was a genius artist. And when I was 6, I was that same artist. And when I was 12, I hadn't gotten any better. And I realized my mom had lied to me. I was not a genius artist. I was terrible. But my storytelling skills were pretty damn good, and they got better as I went. But I have always given comics accurately the credit for making me want to tell stories on paper, and listening
Hmm.
to all these other stories and early television and you know, classics illustrated comics, especially, which led me to reading all of the short stories and novels they represented, or the ones I could get my hands on. And you know, when I discovered Edgar Rice Burroughs, I no longer wanted to be a writer. I had to be one.
Right.
That really, a 10 or 11-year-old boy, especially at that time of history, it was catnip. You know, I was hooked.
Hmm. I mean, talking of getting hooked by another because of another writer, I'm quite curious how Joe Hill became involved in writing the foreword for this book, and it must be a huge compliment for you to read what he's written about you, the way he inspired you, and the way that his father handed him the drive-in when he was just 13 years old, and that just kind of hooked him into your
Well,
story.
I knew Joe liked my work because, you know, he was also had a small piece in a documentary that was made about me called All Hail the Popcorn King. And Bruce Campbell and him and James Purefoy and some others had commentary about me. And he had talked about how that influenced. And I'd met him once at I think it was a World Horror in Austin. It could have been World Fantasy. I don't remember. And he said that when he was a kid, the drive-in was a big influence, and that somewhere he had a Night Runners novel in his drawer or
Yeah.
something like that. You know, he may have been joking, but the point is that he was well aware of my work, and it influenced him, along with others, of course. But I'm proud to feel that it was significant. You know, uh, and Joe and his brother Owen and I have become friends over the years, and I think the world of both of them. And for Joe to say the things he said and to say them so astutely meant a tremendous amount to me. Sure did.
Mhm. Yeah. Something I want to talk about is something that really interests me is at the beginning of the story, the Hoodoo Man on the Midnight Train.
Yeah.
It said that you thought before you wrote that you thought that you said everything that you wanted to say about westerns.
Right.
So I'm really curious. What was it that pulled you back into writing another western story? And also, after decades of writing, what is it that still kind of how do you what was it that excited you again there to bring you back into the western just to
Well,
write that specifically?
it was a request, and I wasn't sure I was going to do it, and I thought maybe I would not. But the more I thought about it, I thought, well, you know, I got one more in me. I'll do that.
Uh-huh.
And then the next thing I know, I'd written another one, The Hungry Snow, and I haven't written one since then. But I do have a straight western novel partly written, and I
Right.
published straight western novels like The Thicket and The Magic Wagon's kind of borderline, and Paradise Sky, which is my favorite of all my novels, is a historical western. You know, and so I don't know that that's as dead as I thought it was at that time. I think I
Yeah.
just needed a kick in the pants, you know, to do it again. But you know, we'll see. We'll see.
No, I mean the reason I ask is that I felt there was kind of a poetic or a neat irony in the fact that you felt that you'd emptied this tank on the westerns, and then all of a sudden you end up writing this story about this man with all of this baggage
Yeah,
he's got that he wants to kind of to get rid of. It was
yeah.
just
I
kind
think
of
there's some symbols in there.
yeah. Were you aware of that when you wrote it, or when you maybe reread it?
No, I was not aware of it, and I wasn't aware of it when I read to you. You said it. I wasn't aware of it, but
No.
it makes sense. I don't often think that I'm doing a certain thing when I'm doing it. I may have some inkling, but I don't necessarily realize it because I write so heavily from the subconscious. That's how I've trained myself. And so the subconscious, excuse me, has already looked at these things and sorted them and
Yeah.
has thought about them and has said, well, I'm going to put this on the back shelf until you need it or if you need it. And so when I write, I'm not necessarily thinking, oh, the rose means this.
Yeah.
But sometimes when looking back through the work, excuse me, I can see that, there are certainly things in my own life or considerations in my own life that find their way into the work. A lot of times, very heavily. I think that it may be what gives my work at its best. When it is at its best, the resonance that it has is because it comes from sorting, as I said, all of this material by my subconscious.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the reason that I really enjoyed this a lot more than a lot of other authors is the fact that it felt, and you said so yourself, it is really a lot of it comes from personal inspirations, which
Yes,
obviously all writers, a lot of themselves they bring to their books,
sure, of course.
but the stuff that you write here, it kind of you can really feel that you've lived and experienced some of these things.
Yeah, yeah.
Another example, for example, is tight little stitches in a dead man's back was something that you wrote when you were going kind of through a bit of a rough patch, you were going through a bit of
Yeah,
a
yeah,
reckoning because you just kind of become a full-time writer and you were
yeah.
trying
I
to
become
look
a
after
full
your
time
family.
writer,
And
and
that
some of the
story
things
kind
that
of deals with someone who feels very
it,
responsible for what's happened.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it deals with a lot of that, and it also, the whole idea was to deal with this apocalyptic idea of the end of the world, so to speak, and so it's going to be grim just by the
Sure.
just by the subject matter. And usually, I have a lot more humor in a story, but in this one, it's limited. Um, there are times I think when the character's trying to be humorous, but it's not very humorous.
Mhm.
He's trying to make this kind of comment here and there, but doesn't have the impact that he might have wanted it to have. And when I wrote that story, I thought it was a real loser. I got to
Mm.
the end of it and I got, man, I don't know what I'm doing here. This is terrible. And I turned it in. They loved it, and I reread it and I go, yeah, this ain't so bad. And it was nominated for a World Fantasy Award thing. And it's gotten a lot of attention. It's been reprinted numerous times, optioned for film a couple of times. It's um, it's one of those stories that seems to leave a mark when people read it. They think about it, and I always feel that that's the sign of a good story, a successful story, is when people return to those images or those thoughts time and time again. Not even the plot necessarily,
Yeah.
but just how it made them feel and how this certain imagery stuck with them. And I have to say, even to this day, the imagery in the story sticks with me and very, very hard. And and maybe why the reason I didn't like it is that it's a painful story.
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
and it was like um, I think a lot of just like disappointment and anger and um, in not only my what was going on in my career at that point where I was having trouble, but um, I think the world in general. You get old enough, you realize that things aren't all going to be hunky dory, and not necessarily just for you, but humanity in general. You know. So anyway, I think a lot of that went into that story, and also it washed a lot of that feelings away. It was like personal therapy, although that's not what
Yeah.
I thought I was doing when I was writing it.
Yeah, but I guess it served as some kind of catharsis for you in a way. No, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh-huh. Talking of the imagery, that was, I think the most impactful imagery for me is God of the Razor, which is a fantastic story. I mean, it starts
thank you.
off in one specific way where this guy goes into this house looking for maybe something that he could sell, and it goes down this completely unexpected alley. I'm really, really curious. Where did the idea of the Lord of the Razor come from? Not just conceptually, but visually, because it's a really visual story. This really kind of hit me hard visually more than conceptually.
I think that the first image of it really were some of the old images of the shadowy version of Jack the Ripper with his top hat and That's not necessarily the image you see as much now. But when I was a kid, it was a guy moving in the shadows wearing a long coat and a top hat. So it started there. But also, I read a lot of archaeology and mythology. And so then I thought about the Aztec. And so a lot of the stuff he wears is Aztecian, where they wear somebody else's skin, and the feet in the
The
head.
feet.
I'm not
Yeah,
sure
that just creeped
exactly
me
where
out.
I came up with that, but I just thought if he had sort of goat-like feet, that would be that might fit. And so a lot of it is borrowed from a variety of different mythologies and old stories and imageries, and some of it probably imageries of creatures in the comics, and who knows, Mr. Uncle Creepy, or
Yeah.
something.
Mhm.
And so it's not really any one thing, it's a variety of things. And I don't know that I consciously thought of it in that way. Again, it goes back to that the subconscious tells me what I'm writing and tells me what imagery to use, and that's what popped out. And
Uh-huh.
what's interesting about that story is I say that the first good story I wrote was probably Fish Night, but
Yeah.
this story probably comes after that because I wrote a novel called The Night Runners, which I couldn't sell for about 7 years because
Mhm.
it was well ahead of the curve of what was going to happen in horror fiction. But I
Yeah.
couldn't sell it for about 7 years because people go, man, this is good, but nope, nope, nope. No,
Yeah. They
not
said it was
that.
too powerful. No. Yeah.
It was too nasty and too powerful. And so I took the imagery of the God of the Razor from that novel and developed that short story, which just came to me in a flash. Most of my stories do, not all, but nearly
Mhm.
nearly all come to
Yeah.
me very, very quickly. I only work about 3 hours a day anyway. And I get up in the morning and I go and write, and the stories come fast. And, there are periods or certain pieces of work that are more difficult and more tedious. And they're all difficult in one way is that I want to write them as best as I can write them and to make them as visual as I can make them and to make them have a resonance that's beyond just the story itself. Sometimes you succeed, sometimes you don't. But
Yeah.
for me, that's what I'm after. And so I would say that he's influenced by every shadowy thought, every mythological weird aspect I've read about, and archaeological things about what they think went on, say, in the Aztec realm, and
Yeah.
and other places as well.
Mhm. I think it make for a great horror icon, that character specifically. And I also believe that when you were curating this anthology, you felt that you could bring this character back for more. You felt there was more to tell about him.
Yeah, and there's not only more to tell. I have.
Oh, you
he
have.
was, yeah, he even was in a Batman anthology, Subway Jack, which a
Right.
lot of people love that story a lot. Me too. I'm very fond of it. But he was also a story called King of Shadows, a short called Janet Finds the Razor, and there are others that and I even used him in a comic. Uh, what was that? The Blood and Shadows, I think it was called. And I've used the character several different times. He was in a recent thing called the Unlikely Affair of the Crawling Razor, which was where I took Edgar Allan Poe's Dupin and his assistant and kind of Sherlock Holmes it a little bit and brought the God of the Razor into the story. And so, he's been with me a while and he pops up now and again.
Uh-huh. And do you still feel that if that's like you said, it was ahead of its time? Do you feel that if I mean, before we were speaking, that all of these stories they kind of resonate throughout time, but do you still feel that that story would have resonated more had it been released 3 or 4 or 5 years earlier?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. It might have, and then again, it might have just been too early. I don't know. It always has had an appreciative audience, though. And
Mm.
I don't consider it one of my best written stories, but I think it's got some of my best scenes in it. Some of the scenes are really, really good with the guy at the bottom of the stairs and all of that. I felt it was a little bit more straightforward in some ways in the prose, but
Yeah.
then when I was rereading it, the description of the God of the Razor and all that was pretty, yeah, pretty sharp, I think, and a lot of it was
Oh yeah,
borrowed
definitely.
from the novel, The Night Runners.
No, no. For me, it was it was the one that really kind of seared its way into my head more than any
Good.
of the other stories in this one. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I do remember the head with the rat crew on it, floating in the water with a rat crew, and I kind of like that. I don't remember the exact line, but
No, it's
I
fantastic.
enjoyed that myself. That stayed with me.
That was great. And another story that I have to talk to you about. Joe Hill also mentions that his personal favorite is Mr. Weed Eater, which is,
Yeah.
I guess, probably the least horror of the bunch, maybe.
Mhm.
But I could imagine this in maybe it's kind of like maybe a segment in a creep show type film, those kind of things. It definitely fits in something like that. But I'm really curious. You said that this is very, very heavily inspired on a true story, which is kind of hard to
Yeah.
believe that someone actually hired a blind
Someone
guy.
actually hired a blind groundskeeper who wandered into my yard, and my little son then once said, "Daddy, there's a man wants to see you," which was ironic because the man was blind. And so I went out, and sure enough, there's a guy in our yard with a pair of sunglasses on, holding a weed eater in one hand, and a cane in the other. And he was wanting me to point him in the right direction. He had gotten off track. And I thought, well, it's nice to hire the disabled, but this is ridiculous.
Okay.
And I took him over and showed, and he had mowed down everything. The whole flower bed and whacked the grass. I mean, it was just a mess. And I kind of took him around, and we, knocked it down a little bit, and I got him some water, and found him a shade tree in their yard to sit under because they were supposed to be back soon. And I just thought, this is insane. This is insane. And so it inspired the story. Of course, the story extrapolates and goes far beyond that. Yeah. But I just thought, you get your ideas from real things. There's another story I wrote. I think it's in the Things Get Ugly, the crime selection, called The Phone Woman, which is also based on a real incident. It couldn't be any crazier. When we lived in that house, it's like crazy arrived on the doorstep regularly. When we moved, I thought, there goes my career.
But it's fantastic. But obviously, I don't want to spoil this story, but I'm really, really curious. I love the ending of this story. Like you said, it extrapolates what happened. But I'm really curious about how, especially kind of how this, how would I say it without spoiling it, the inner vision versus the outward blindness message that is in there. How did that emerge from what actually happened to you in real life?
Subconscious again, you just start saying, what would this happen if my life were different? You start with your own life, not the weed eater.
Yeah, sure.
What if I was, living a different life? What if I had missed, certain things? What if I had not married my wife, but had married this wife?
Yeah.
And what if my family had been like this instead of like the family I have? At that time, I think I just had my son, But I was looking at that, and that's the way I always think, is that how could the good parts of my life go wrong? And sometimes they do go wrong. But I thought, this is the way that I'm thinking about it. But I can say that in retrospect. I was not necessarily conscious of that then. It's what happens with me is that I'll go to bed at night and I'll dream whatever comes next. And I don't always remember that I've dreamed, but I always know that I have when I get up, and I can feel like the tank is full, which is, in my career, has been about 98% of the time. Sometimes it's a little less full, or whatever's in the tank is not got a little too much sludge in it. It's not ready to kind of, fire up the engine, or it fires up the engine poorly. But I've never had like writer's block or the inability to work. And, I have a thing where I try to get 3 to 5 pages a day. There are times when I don't, but that's rare. There are certain projects where I expect a little less or a little more, but that depends on the uniqueness of the situation. But I'll sometimes get 10 or 15 pages in one day, but it's always within about 3 hours. I just don't normally work above that. There's been times when I would go up in the afternoon and maybe work an extra hour, or at night an extra hour, usually on some other project other than my main project. But even that's uncommon, because in like this morning, I worked on an introduction I'm writing, and I worked on a novella I'm writing, and I got about my 3 pages between them. So I didn't get as much, but I just switched from one project to the other. And I've often be writing a main project, say that I'm writing a novel for my publisher, and then I turn around and I'm working on a short story, and I might work on that short story 15 minutes, 30 minutes, and work on the novel the rest of that time. Or I might have a day where I feel more inclined to work longer on the short story and less on the novel. And sometimes it's an essay, sometimes it's a screenplay, sometimes it's I mean, it can vary. Is the point I'm making. And I can sometimes work on 2 or 3 a day. I read books that way. I read 4 or 5 books at one time, but I never get lost. I always know where I am, and I can pick up one and put that down and pick up another one. That's always been. I don't know if it's a gift or a curse, but
it's a gift because I wish I could do that. Yeah, I can't do that. I 2 at the most I could read at the same time. I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm comfortable doing that, and in the same sense, I'm comfortable working on a variety of stories, and I can say it works for me because I've been doing it. Well, although I've been writing 52 years, my method, of working really developed over probably about 10 years, and then I came to that method of working and have pretty well stuck to it. It's not that I wouldn't change if it quit working for me, or it's not that I wouldn't do something different if I just felt compelled to go in. Like I said, those occasional afternoons or evenings, I'll do it and have done it. But my common work method is pretty much what I described before. And I'm a subconscious writer. That subconscious, like I said, is a dream state, and I try to maintain that before the day creeps in. So I try to get up, take my dog out, have the coffee, breakfast, go to work, and immediately usually when I put my fingers on the keys, it's there and almost instantly. I don't usually have to stop and think much because I've already thought about it.
All right. So
and I'm not plotting in any conscious way, but I'm sure my subconscious is, because people say, do you plot? No. Do you write outlines? Not unless I have to for a publisher or something, and then I'll never be able to follow it. So and if I write too much like that, I feel like I've already written and I'm no longer interested. And so to me, it's got to be an organic process.
That's quite curious, because most writers that I speak to, they sit down and write, and then they rack their brains to surprise themselves, to keep themselves enticed to keep writing. But it sounds like you don't do that at all, no?
Well, no. I'm surprised because I don't know what's lurking inside my subconscious.
So you don't actively, consciously try to surprise yourself.
Subconscious is like a stripper; it reveals a little bit at a time.
Yeah.
And but it's consistent, and I usually just depend on it, and I try to just say, my subconscious, my dream state, those parts of the Freudian depths have already looked at all this stuff and sorted it, and there will be a rare time when I can feel that it has not quite figured it out. And in that case, I'll jump over to something else that I find has been figured out, or something I've already started. And usually once I start something, if I like it enough to continue on it, and I have pieces and fragments of a lot of things I haven't finished, and sometimes we'll come back to years later and finish, I just work on that until it is sorted. But I'm constantly surprised. I go, I had no idea that was going to happen. I didn't know the character was going to do that. But probably, if your subconscious, if I could dig down in there and slice and dice it, I'd probably discover that it already knew.
It's already there.
Yeah, it's already there.
Yeah. Talking of things that maybe some things that you think will take a little bit longer, that need a bit more time to gestate. I can't not speak to you about Bubba Ho-Tep, which is also included in this story. I mean, obviously that was I couldn't believe it was 23 years ago since the film came out already.
Yeah.
And there has been there's always been kind of these rumors of this Bubba Nosferatu, which is like is it a prequel?
Not gonna happen.
Not gonna happen at all, no?
No, not with me or Bruce, probably. Don had it going at one point. I thought that he was going to do it, and but I just don't think it played out. They never really got what they needed, the financing or the script or whatever it was, and it didn't happen. Unless Don is able at some point in the future to get it off the ground, I think that's pretty well dead, And I'm not so sure that that's a bad thing, because I think that this stands on its own. I think Don made a classic film, if I say so myself.
Yeah, I think you
And
said it's your favorite adaptation
yeah,
of
and it's
from your
very
work.
much like what I wrote, you know. And there were some things changed that I think he had to change, and it wasn't one of those things where he just went in and arbitrarily said, "Well, I'll just see what I can do here because I
Yeah.
have a vision." What he did was he said, "I'm going to take Joe's vision and I'm going to turn it into something that's cinematic and wonderful, and is also his." And he
Uh-huh.
did, and he wrote the
Nice.
screenplay. The sucker, I didn't think it could be done. You know, I told
Yeah,
him it couldn't be done, and he made a fool of me, didn't he?
he did. It's a
Yeah,
fantastic film. Yeah,
listen,
as
I
soon as I
went,
finished
Don. I'm going
reading
to
it,
see. I'm going to see him next week. You know, but it's just unless something's come up that I don't know about,
yeah.
there's not been a sequel. There's been like I wrote a prequel to it.
I was going to say,
Not
did you write? Right.
Bubba Ho-Tep and the Cosmic Bloodsuckers is a prequel to all of it, and I'm not even sure I should have done that. I think it reads well, but the fact is that I liked it kind of on its lonesome. You know, I like
Yeah.
the fact that because when I wrote it, I was dealing with my mother had to be in a rest home at that point, and
Right.
she had an accident, a car accident. And so I was there a lot. So I was dealing with dark things. And when I was asked to write it, that and my love for Elvis Presley and his music, you know, and the fact that my brother, who's 17 years older than me, had known Elvis and married a girl who graduated with Elvis.
Really?
And yeah, and my brother tried to record Sun Records. And so there was a lot of that. And then, of course, JFK was assassinated when I was about 11, I believe. Um, so all of those factors were lying there. And then this stuff happened with my mom, which was dark and bothersome. And, you know, and you're at that age, I guess I was probably in my 40s. And, you know, it's that whole thing about realizing that life is short. I always realized that though, even when in my 20s. But I think in my 40s, the mortality was much more aware for me. You know, I was because you know I'm dealing with my mom doing this, and I was beginning to have friends that were aging or dying and that were older than me. You know that
Yeah.
because a lot of my friends were always like 20, 30 years older than me.
Right.
And my family, I would, you know, like I said, my dad was 42 when I was born, so he had died by then. My mother was in this bad situation, so I think all of that combined with the Elvis and the JFK gave that story its resonance. And when I see it now, I really feel that even more because now I'm that age.
Yep.
And so you begin to
Yeah.
think, okay. And I think the whole idea about what matters in life, you know, a family and all that, and it's not about being famous or how rich you are. Those are all nice little, you know, nuggets because in my life I've made a lot of money. I've spent a lot of money. I've been famous enough. You
Yeah.
know, I'm not necessarily looking to be any more famous than I am. Um, but I think you know you begin to realize what matters. Those things don't sustain. You know, they're not going to be there at some point. But maybe your family will, and maybe as you get closer to the end, if you have a good relationship with your family, that's really going to count for something. I
Yeah.
promise.
And that was what I really loved about also Not From Detroit as well. That was a fantastic little story.
You.
And it was kind of, and they go right next to each other. Not From Detroit and Bubba Ho-Tep right after it. But it was just, I
Yeah,
just thought it was really, really. It kind of starts off cozy and quaint with this elderly couple, and then just goes into this kind of action horror. I mean, you've just answered the question, but I was really curious why you liked kind of having antagonists who were these aging characters who were already staring death in the face, and then
yeah.
they have to face death in
Well, you
another
know,
way.
my wife and I've been married 52 years. In the last few years, she's had Alzheimer's and
Right.
she's had to go into care because I took care of her for about 5 years, and it got so bad that she had to have that. And so that's tough on me because
Sure.
you know she's my everything. You know, she was the person that was with me when I sold my first piece, and I was 21 years old, and we married when I was 21, and she was 21, and we've been together ever since. And that's what I say about life throws you some curves. You know, it's just full of you know little
Yeah.
moments when you would rather not have them. You know, and
Absolutely.
but you have to go on. I mean, that's what life's also about. You have to live it. You don't just say, fold up and cash in, and I've had some hard moments in my life. I've had, just like a lot of people, I'm no exception, but boy, have I had some good ones, and I've had more good ones than bad ones. And I had this great relationship with my wife, and I have these great kids. And, I just feel like I've been like the luckiest guy ever. And I got to do exactly what I wanted to do since I was 4 years old. I wanted to write. I didn't understand it was a career then. I just knew I wanted to tell these stories. And when I was 11 or 12, I began to understand, oh, people make a living doing this.
Yeah.
I got to do that. And I was interested in martial arts ever since I was a child.
Yeah,
And
that's right as
I
well.
got to
Yeah.
do that. And, until last year, I was practicing, still teaching, and I had to go in for a hernia operation, which did not go well. And it went so bad, I had to go into a coma and learn to stay in the hospital for a couple of months. And then I was in a wheelchair. And then I had to teach myself to stand and walk again, which I did. And so I'm back, but nonetheless, I lost a little bit there, and a little bit of that I'm never going to get back. And so
Sure.
I've got back more than most people. I mean, I'm 74 this month, and I feel a hell of a lot younger than that. And when I was teaching martial arts the week before I went in, I certainly felt a lot younger than that. And I constantly proved I felt a lot younger than that. But, you come to that point when you have these surprises in life where you have to look at them and say, okay, it's like Bubba Ho-Tep.
Yep.
It really is like Bubba Ho-Tep. What matters, what counts when you get to the end? And I hope the hell I'm not at the end yet. I still feel creative, and I'm working on new material. I have a screenplay coming out as a film, and I have all sorts of, short stories, novels, essays, introductions, and I have a lot of these things that I've agreed to do on a certain timeline. So it's not like I don't have plenty to do, but you do evaluate yourself and say what matters, and work matters, but family really matters, and
Yeah.
your life, and who you think you are. I'm not at that point where I'm a skeptic, not a cynic, though I've been stressed a few times on that in the last few years. But I feel like that you live life, and to a certain extent, the writing and was the fuel for that, and martial arts were the fuel for that. Those were the logs I was throwing on the fire to enjoy who I was, and to enjoy my family, and to try to do, because you're feeding your family. That's a great feeling that you're taking care of your people, so to speak. So I've certainly got no complaints at this point, and I'm still moving forward.
I mean, a lot of the things that you've written in this book just alone must have, must have helped you to process, like you said, you process and realize what the
Yeah.
important things are in life. So that must have really, really helped you through what's happened with your wife, and also what's just happened
Yes.
with yourself with the
No, it did.
hernia, and
There's
to
no
kind
doubt
of
about it.
recover and to get better afterwards, no?
Yeah, and like when I wrote Night They Missed the Horror Show, it helped me focus on this racism that had bothered me for so long. And many of the things you see in that story really happen, although it's extrapolated well beyond that. But what I was talking about earlier, it's kind of a therapy. That's
Exactly.
exactly what it is. It's kind of a therapy, but it's also an evaluation of life and what you've seen and what matters to you. And that's what makes writing so extraordinary. And the fact that it comes from you internally, even to this day, I go, where the hell did that come from?
Yeah.
And a lot of times I can point, like I do it in the introductions, to certain things. Okay, there was this, there was that, but that's the catalyst. But how does all that develop and come to you, and come to you in a story? And I don't know if some people are just born creative. I certainly think there are a lot of people that are creative that we never know how creative they are. And it may be that most people have some kind of creative impulse, but the ability to make that impulse vibrate and become solid, sort of like the Flash going through a wall, and then he comes out on the other side and he's the Flash again. And I always felt that, that it's such a unique thing, that it's such a mystery that I never, I know some of the things about the subconscious and things like that, but I myself really don't understand where it comes from. And it's why I teach writing classes and stuff, but I never feel you can teach anybody how to write. You can teach somebody how to better write or how to get in touch with their creative feelings. But there are people that can write beautifully, but just have no power. They have nothing there. It doesn't happen. You know, you have some people that write crudely, but they've got something. You know, there's just something vibrating there. You know, like again, the Flash making his way through that brick wall. You just hope he gets to the other side.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, we're curious, talking about your process. I'm quite curious how you have worked with editors in the past, because it sounds like you've got a very much your own vision of how you want your stories, because they come to you almost like in the dreams, like you said. So I'm quite curious how you.
Well, I don't have a adversarial relationship with editors on purpose, and I don't even have an adversarial relationship with most of them. And but I am firm in what I want to do, and if they don't want to do it, I can always move on. You know, and have. And there's been times when I go, nope, I'm not doing that. And because I didn't get into it just to make a living. You know, I got into it to make a living, and I have to make a living at it because it keeps me not only in beans, but it keeps me in the process of writing constantly. But there are certain things I just won't do. If somebody suggests something that's better than what I've got and achieves what I wanted to achieve better than how I achieved it, you damn right I'll change it and or be influenced by it. But it's like I write Lansdale stories better than other people write Lansdale stories. I may not be able to write other people's stories, and I may not even be any good, but I'm good for me. And I know what I want. I may not write the world's best dialogue, but I write the best Lansdale dialogue. And and so sometimes, and certainly in some of the film adaptations, I go, really, guys, really, you think that's better than what I had? You know, and but you know, they have a vision. So you know, I'm willing to listen to an editor, but I'm not a slave to an editor. And especially in short stories, I'm less willing to listen in short stories than I am in novels, because novels, I think was it William Somerset Maugham who said a novel's an easy way to write a short story. I think that's true.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm not a writer, but I just imagine that. I think short stories is, like I said before, the flash fiction is something that needs to be given so much more respect, because I just think that is so much more difficult to create.
It's a different part of your creative process. You know, I tried to. The first thing, you know, you don't really master anything, but the thing that I got good at early on was the short, the flash fiction. I wrote a bunch of them and sold nearly all of them. I would eat. My wife would fix this popcorn, and we would eat too much popcorn. And at night, I'd have a dream. Next morning, I'd get up and write that dream. And sometimes I changed it around and moved it around, because even when I'm dreaming and aware of it, I can change them whenever I want to. It's just like I'm directing a film and go, no, I don't like that. And so I would get up and I would have these complete stories. Some of them sold to Twilight Zone magazine. I think a couple like that went to Mike's Chain, and then over the years to anthologies, because a lot of my stories were actually in anthologies more than magazines, though I did that too. But anthologies were my meat. I was like an anthology king there for a while. And to some extent, I'm still asked to do them, but I don't do as many of them as I once did, because I have other fish I'm frying right now. But nonetheless, you know, that's again back to that dream state. But that popcorn would make me have an upset stomach, would have dreams. I would always know when the bank account was getting low, because my wife, I would hear, she was shaking that popcorn. She didn't like to tell me directly because it would put too much pressure on me, or so she felt. And but she had or she might go, when's that next check coming in? I go, oh hell. We need some money here.
Listen, just before I let you go, Joe, I mean, you said that you've got a screenplay on the go and some other things in the oven. Is there anything that you can give us a little hint about what's coming next that we can look
Well,
forward
yeah,
to?
it's been announced, so you can. Well, first of all, let me back up a little bit. I wrote a short adaptation of Howard Waldrop's Night of the Cooters, and it was filmed with Vincent D'Onofrio starring and directing. So it exists, but there are three other stories that are Howard Waldrop adaptations by other writers. They're all, I think, going to be put together as one thing. George R.
Right.
Martin is the producer, and he was best friends with Howard. And so there's that going for me. And then I did excuse me, an alarm went off over here. I did a longer adaptation, a feature of his story. And these, by the way, those all are animated to some extent.
Right.
And this one I did for him was called A Dozen Tough Jobs. And it was a novella that Howard had written and about the labors of Hercules in 1920s Mississippi. And so I adapted that, and that was picked up by Lions Forge. This was also done for George, who is producing, and Lions Forge picked it up, and it's currently in a state of production right now. So I and along with some of the other people involved, had a meeting with the directors recently. There's two guys, and man, they're smart son of a guns, you know. And anyway, they're the directors of the film. And so that's in the process. I don't know exactly where it is right now. And then there are 3 or 4 other film projects that are hanging that may or may not, but those are ones that not only have, but or will. They're in that process. And I've got a new novel planned for next year. And I'm working on a memoir. I'm about 2/3 through it, and it's eating my lunch. Let me tell you. It's one of those things where I get my minimum every day, 3 pages, you know. And then when I first half of it was easy, and that's because you've had more time to process the earlier part of your life.
Right.
And people always say, "Why is that easier?" You've had more time to look at it. You've had more time to turn good stuff into bad stuff, or bad stuff into good stuff, or to tell lies that you believe. And so that first half, I didn't have as much trouble. And also the second half involves, you know, meeting my wife and my kids. And that's some of that is delicate because my wife is so important to me, you know. And so I'm working on that. So I hope to have that finished at least and I usually do 1 draft and a polish, nothing. That's it. I don't do all these multiple drafts. But with the memoir, it's different because you'll think of something and go, oh yeah. And then you'll say, you know what, I'm going to take that out because that embarrasses somebody that doesn't need to be embarrassed, or so on. I'm not trying to have a memoir, you know, that not only goes beyond the common memoir stuff in my events in my life, but steps on people's toes that don't need stepping on. There are some people I step on gladly in this, but it's just, yeah. And you know, it's that's not what it's about. And it's really a lot of material there that I hope to trim down some, you know. But that's why I'm working on that.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time, Joe. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you. I wish you the best of luck with with the release of the anthology. I tried to get hold of a physical copy the other day, and it's already sold out on Amazon. So
I know we're trying to get them to reprint it now because they're saying, "Oh, we can reprint it in November." What? Yeah. It's gone overnight. So you know
that's fantastic news. Yeah. So that's great. Thank you so much again. And hopefully I get to speak to you again sometime, either about one of these screenplays or the memoir, which I cannot wait to read.
Yeah. Well, me either.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time. Have the best day. All right. Take care. Bye now.